James Wilkins was 42. Up until the night he stepped into a bedroom closet that was exactly half empty, he thought his marriage was just going through a quiet, rough patch. He still drove the same truck he'd had for 6 years, wore his old, dark utility jacket to every job site, the kind built for cold mornings and concrete, not company parties or big charity nights. Every morning, he was already working before the city even woke up, carrying a battered thermos and a tube of blueprints under his arm. That's what Ronda saw. But there was more under the surface. Silently, without a fight or even one real conversation, she'd made up her mind. For her, James's steadiness was just stagnation. His discipline had become a ceiling he didn't bother to question anymore. She'd decided the man she married had, in her eyes, just stopped becoming anything new. For nearly 11 months, while James was catching major structural failures in the city's buildings, the kind other engineers didn't even notice, and quietly managing a family trust worth 8 figures that he'd never mentioned in 12 years of marriage, Ronda was putting together a life she already planned to step into. The night she finally told him, she was calm, in that way you can only be when a choice was made a long time ago. She didn't pace, didn't soften it. She told James she'd found someone else, someone with the presence she wanted, a man with polish, with leverage, someone who, she said, slowly, word by word, actually saw what a woman like her was worth. She called him, in her exact words, an upgrade. She had no idea she was leaving the wealthiest private black man in the city. She had no clue the man she'd been quietly underestimating for almost a year had never in his adult life needed to tell anyone what he'd built. Before I tell you what James did next, drop in the comments, where are you in the world watching this from? And listen, I need your help proving something. My mom always said I'd never reach 1,000 subscribers. If she's wrong, hit subscribe now. Trust me, you're not ready for what this man does next. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for her or ask her to stay. He didn't explain or defend or leave her a single word she could use later. He just waited until she was completely done. Then he stood up, walked into his late grandfather's study, a room he hadn't entered in over 3 years, and opened the bottom drawer of the wide old oak desk. Inside, there was one leather-bound document. He flipped to the page listing the Wilkins Industrial Infrastructure Trust's active holdings, $45,800,000, completely irrevocable, created before his marriage, untouchable by any court, any lawyer, no matter how they tried to spin it. He closed it, not because he was done, but because what came next wasn't about anger, it was about precision. He called the one person who'd always said when he was ready to move, she wanted to be his first call. Some men don't have to fight for what they own because they never needed to. 6 weeks before, the Transit Authority had filed their inspection report, 14 pages, 23 data points, one conclusion stamped big and green on the cover, structurally satisfactory, just needs maintenance in about 1.5 years. James had read it twice at lunch the previous Tuesday. He wasn't really looking at what was in the report, but what wasn't. He always arrived before his crew, not because he had to, but because the structure always told the truth before anyone else got there. The report had flagged 3 beams in the North Corridor for surface spalling, a normal thing in a building this old. The city engineers had photographed the cracks, measured them, compared the specs, and decided they were just cosmetic. James crouched down by the 3rd column, ran his thumb along the crack. He wasn't measuring it, just reading the angle. Most surface cracks run vertical, gravity, shrinkage, compression over the years. You'll see them in nearly every building over 30 years old, and 9 times out of 10, they don't mean much. But this one ran at a 31-degree angle. He stood and pulled a level from his jacket pocket, set it along the column. The bubble didn't center. He stepped back, looked up the 14-foot column to where it met the transit deck, and he waited, like a guy who stopped asking what and started worrying about when. The column had shifted, not in a dramatic way, not enough for anyone except someone like James to notice, but it moved about 4 millimeters sideways, right beyond tolerance. In engineering, 4 millimeters past the limit isn't just a measurement, it's a countdown. He sat on the floor of that corridor for 22 minutes with a mechanical pencil and the original specs, running the numbers until the math matched what his gut already knew. Then, he called the transit authority's chief engineer. He didn't just flag it for maintenance, he shut it down. Some men only see what's in front of them. James Wilkins saw what was coming. In 12 years, Ronda never once asked him what he saw when he looked at the two of them.
That night, the dinner table was set the way Ronda always did when she wanted things to feel deliberate. Cloth napkins, the good plates, candles she never lit for a regular night. James got in from the site at 6:30, still in his jacket, washed his hands, and sat down. That was enough. Ronda looked at his boots, then looked at him. She didn't say anything right away, which in their house was always worse than talking. She let the silence grow, then started in. She'd been at a company reception that afternoon, a fancy networking thing full of executives signaling their seriousness. Somewhere in the story, it turned from a story into a measurement. She mentioned Howard Otten by name for the first time, not like it was new, more like she'd been waiting to drop it. He had a penthouse. He was known for his investment portfolio everywhere he went, custom suits, presents, she said. She looked at James' jacket draped on his chair, his boots by the door. She didn't have to finish, but she did. Do you know what it's like to walk into a room like that and have nothing to point to? He didn't answer, just reached for his glass and let her keep talking. She did. For 20 minutes, she listed everything missing in their life. The events uninvited to, the addresses they didn't have, the circles she couldn't move through because, as she put it, her husband chose a ceiling. James looked at his boots at some point in all of this. He thought about that support beam he'd locked down, the crack that looked harmless, the kind of shift invisible to most people. He remembered his grandfather, a man who built 3 warehouses and a commercial dock by 50, who never once went to a gala. His grandfather would always say, leaning on something he'd just built, a building that screams for attention is usually hiding a weak frame. James set his glass down, picked up his fork. Ronda kept talking. He didn't argue. He didn't correct her, not because he had nothing to say, but because sometimes the truth takes longer than the other person is willing to listen. And he knew, with the same certainty he'd had that morning, that what was breaking in this house had nothing to do with what she wore into a room. It was all about what she couldn't see in the man across from her. The house felt different when he stepped in. Not louder or angrier, just rearranged. She was in the living room, not the kitchen or upstairs, the formal spot, the spot for guests. She chose it for a reason. James spotted the envelope before he even read her face. He set his keys down, didn't ask. She told him she'd made her decision and she'd been holding onto it too long already. Her voice was steady, like she'd practiced until it was no longer hard. She slid the envelope across the table. He didn't pick it up. She was expecting, an argument, or at least some urgency. But James just looked at it the same way he always looked at everything, like a man who reads every detail before he decides what it means. So she told him what was inside. Papers had been filed. Her attorney had the asset list. The split was clean. She wanted nothing but what was legally hers and expected the same back. And then, because Ronda could never leave without making sure you knew exactly what you were about to miss, she told him about Howard. Not like a summary, but with detail. 3 luxury high-rises under construction, investors flying in for meetings, name recognition that opened every door. She talked about how it felt to stand in a room like that, where ambition wasn't rare, it was the standard, where everyone was becoming something, not just settling. She called Howard an upgrade. Not carelessly, not out of anger, like she'd been saving that word. An upgrade. James let every word land. Then, with the same calm he handled every beam and fracture, he asked just one question. Have you considered the stability of his foundation? She didn't answer. James looked at the envelope, turned it over, set it back down. He stood up, walked to the doorway, and paused with his hand on the frame, staring at nothing, maybe everything, then walked outside. He didn't explain. Some things you just let the structure reveal on its own. That night, he went to the office after midnight. Not Ronda's space. She learned early on to leave that room alone, not because James ever told her, but because it felt different, like air that knew how to hold weight. The Wilkins Industrial Infrastructure Trust was founded in 1989 by his grandfather, before the city wanted the East Waterfront, before the old docks were a trophy for investors.
Grown quietly, carefully, and shifted to James the day his grandfather was buried, sealed in an envelope with only his name. He pulled up the current holdings report, waited for the number. $45,840,000. The docks, leases on 4 East Corridor buildings, 3 industrial parcels the city tried to buy for nearly a decade. Active, set. Nowhere in the document did Ronda's name appear. He sat with that for a while, not proud exactly, something quieter, a stillness that comes from knowing what you've built and not mixing that with who you are. The next morning, he drove 40 minutes north to Alden Grove Medical Center, a private place that specialized in long-term cardiac care. Clean, quiet, expensive in a way that doesn't need to show off. Lucille Johnson had lived there 4 years. She was 71, sharp as ever, and held a soft spot for James, the way some older women are for men who remind them of someone they once cared about. She was also Ronda's mom. James came by every few weeks, work permitting, always brought something, her favorite tea, crosswords, once a radio because she missed music in the evenings. He always stayed at least an hour. He'd been the one funding her care since his first year of marriage, paying through an anonymous account tied to the trust. Lucille didn't know. Ronda didn't know. James never said a word, just because in his family you didn't talk about what you did for people. He thought about the envelope. He thought about upgrade, and about Lucille's hand squeezing his each time he left, a quiet, "Don't be a stranger, thank you." He looked at a name, Olga Peterson. He put his phone away, but not for long. Olga Peterson had her office on the 14th floor of a building James happened to own. She was his grandfather's attorney first, handled the trust when it was created, the docks, every piece of the family's holdings as they moved from solid to generational wealth. After his grandfather died, she stayed on, not because James asked, but because she understood what the Wilkins name meant, and she wasn't one to walk away from something she'd helped build. She was 63, sharp, listened in a way that felt like every word was measured as it hung between you. She'd won cases in rooms where the outcome was set before she even opened her briefcase. That, she'd told James, is how she liked it. James told her about the papers, about Howard Otten, about the dinner and the word Ronda used. He was concise, the kind of concise you get when you've already handled the emotion and are just dealing with the structure now. Olga listened, didn't interrupt. When he finished, she pulled the trust paperwork from the file already open. With her, the important documents were always ready before the client walked in. She confirmed what James already knew but needed to hear out loud, from someone's word no judge in the state would question. The trust was set up in 1989, 14 years before his marriage, 11 years before Ronda. Irrevocable. No divorce, no judge, no attorney could touch it or force it into the asset pool. Whatever Ronda's lawyers thought they could do, the trust wouldn't move. 12 years, 3 law firms, a pile of billable hours, and not one bit of it would reach what James's grandfather built before Ronda even knew his last name. Then he gave Olga 2 instructions. First, total freeze on all voluntary financial disclosures. Nothing goes out except what the law demands, by writing. Every document, every detail, only if it's required. Let Ronda's lawyers dig for what they could find. Olga made a note. The second instruction made her pause. James wanted a full forensic audit of Howard Otten's active projects. Not just a background check, not just a surface look. Every project, every investor, every permit filed in the last 3 years. She asked what she was looking for. James looked her in the eye. I don't know yet, but I've seen enough weak frames to know when someone's got something to hide. She promised results in 2 weeks, delivered in 9 days. And what she found wasn't just a weak frame. It was the kind of building that should never have been allowed to stand. Olga didn't call him when the results came in. She just sent a text, "Come in, bring an hour."
He showed up at her office at 7 the next morning. She'd already been there for 2 hours. He sat down, and she started from the top. First came Howard Otten's real financial situation. The Ronda investment portfolio Ronda described at dinner, the steady quarterly earnings, the big East Corridor projects, the out-of-state investors who only flew in to meet Howard, none of it actually belonged to him. He was so leveraged, the numbers barely made sense anymore. 2 out of his 3 development projects were used as collateral against debt he'd already restructured twice in 18 months. When you stripped away the debt, Howard's personal holdings were worth less than $400,000. Even the penthouse was a lease, not his to own. The investors Ronda talked about with such confidence? Olga looked into them. 3 names. 2 of them pulled out of Howard's main East Corridor project 6 months ago. The third filed a complaint with the Commercial Arbitration Board, and Howard's lawyers were quietly trying to handle it. The so-called empire Ronda described was dress-setting, nothing behind it. James flipped through the documents, not showing anything on his face. Olga moved to the second pile. George Hall had been a senior building inspector with the city's structural compliance team for 11 years. He had a clean record and boring reviews. Exactly the kind of guy a desperate developer needs, the kind no one pays attention to. For 14 months, Hall signed off on structural safety certifications he'd never actually checked, all of them tied to a handful of waterfront development proposals. Olga set out 1 permit, then another, then a third. James picked up the nearest. He read the certified load tolerances, the inspection dates, the trail of signatures. He saw through it, just like he had with that beam in the transit corridor. He wasn't looking at what the page said, but what the gaps meant. He checked the addresses. Each one was along the eastern waterfront, all right next to the Wilkins docks. Olga let that sit before she shifted to the third pile.
Richard Harrison was the money, a commercial lender with just enough freedom and just enough buy-in from Howard to cross from optimistic to complicit. He gave out loans based on the fake numbers Hall's forged permits created, numbers that only added up if the Wilkins docks were somehow acquired, devalued, or forced into a desperate sale through a series of manufactured compliance violations. The whole plan needed James's property. Nothing else would work. Not something similar, not close enough. His. The docks his grandfather bought long before Howard Otten filed a business registration, before Hall took the inspector's exam, before Harrison approved a single loan. Ronda had left him for a man trying to steal from him. Called it an upgrade. Olga watched him. "How do you want to move?" she asked. James looked up. "We start at the divorce table." "Everything else," he said, quiet, "comes after." Olga wrote that down. She'd worked with powerful men who, in James's spot, would lead straight with their most damaging evidence. James Wilkins had chosen to face a divorce mediation before stepping into a boardroom. In her mind, it wasn't hesitation. It was a man making sure he was absolutely right before taking any step at all. Mediation was set at 9 a.m. on a building on Commerce Street. Ronda's attorneys picked it for neutral ground. It wasn't neutral ground. The building's commercial lease ran through a Wilkins Infrastructure Holdings subsidiary, a detail missing from the day's agenda, and one Ronda and her attorneys had no reason to suspect. James never said a word about it. He just arrived at 9, sat at his side of the table, and set down a single leather portfolio. Ronda's lead attorney, Carver, cold and sharp, started off by laying out the terms: a piece of James's reported earnings, joint claim on the house, and full financial disclosure of everything gained during the marriage. Carver used disclosure 4 times in the first 7 minutes.
Olga let him talk. Then she slid the first document over. Just a cover page. The trust certificate dated 1989. Wilkins Industrial Infrastructure Trust in bold at the top. The irrevocability clause underlined. Carver read it, then read it again. Olga placed the current assets summary next. Only the cover and total value. Ronda stared at the number. She thought James lived comfortably, maybe had some savings. She'd built her whole exit strategy around the idea that the guy in the work jacket driving a truck with a cracked side mirror was just what he appeared. $45,840,000. Premarital, irrevocable, untouchable. Carver whispered to his colleague, a tense, quick back and forth. Nobody needed to hear it to know what it meant. The third document went down. It listed, in the trust's assets, a controlling interest in the Alden Grove Medical Network, the parent company for the facility where Lucille Johnson had lived for 4 years, the one Ronda visited on birthdays and holidays. The facility, she told friends, was the best private care in the city. James watched her read. He didn't look away. She looked up, started to speak, and stopped. He let the silence do the talking. Ronda's attorneys asked for a 15-minute break. James stayed put. He poured himself some water, left his phone alone, and didn't talk to Olga. He sat there, in a room he happened to own the lease on, and waited. When they all came back, Carver put forward a much more modest offer. Olga declined and made their last counter, exactly what the law allowed. Nothing extra. What she'd brought into the marriage, valued at the date of entry, adjusted for inflation. That was it.
Carver checked the number, looked at Ronda. She gave him the brief nod of someone who finally gets the argument was settled before they even arrived. James signed. Straightforward, calm, no drama. He didn't thank anyone, didn't make a speech, didn't give a final word. He stood up and walked out. The so-called upgrade had been across from her for 12 years. She just signed the papers to let him leave. Howard Otten had his investment presentation booked for 11 a.m. on the 32nd floor of Sterling Tower, that glass-walled boardroom, chosen for the optics, the look of power. 12 minutes in, the door opened. Howard stopped talking mid-sentence, staring at James like he was an interruption that would fix itself. He asked his assistant, quietly but firmly, to have security escort the visitors out. Security showed up fast. One of them addressed James by name because, in a building with a lease tied to the Wilkins Trust, management already knew James Wilkins would be there at 11. Security stepped back. Howard glanced at them, then at James. The pitch was interrupted, his rhythm broken, and now 8 investors, who'd rearranged their lives to be there, had their eyes on James. James introduced himself, not to Howard, to the investors, gave his name and title, sole managing trustee of the Wilkins Industrial Infrastructure Trust, the legal owner of the docks that Howard was pitching as the main feature of his development plan. So the room had spent 12 minutes listening to plans to buy property from a man who'd never agreed to sell. Olga slid the forensic audit findings to the nearest investors, color-coded, organized, with a clear intro outlining exactly what each part said.
Permit forgeries were up first. All 8 certifications with Hall's signature, all verifying site conditions that didn't exist. Olga made a point. The trust's managing director was a licensed structural engineer who checked every site in person and was ready to testify to the difference between the paperwork and reality. Hall just looked down, never meeting anyone's eyes again. Next came the loan documents. Harrison reached for his the second Olga mentioned it. He skimmed for 90 seconds, not trying to learn, just finding the dividing line between his firm's liability and Howard's. He closed his file, looked at Howard once, then turned to the investor next to him and said, in a flat voice, that Hargrove Capital Group was pulling out of the project effective immediately, pending a full internal compliance review. Howard tried to speak, looked at his lawyers, then the investors. But the investors were watching James now, really watching him, the way a room does when everyone quietly figures out who actually knows the score. James just let them look. Then he picked up Olga's case, thanked everyone for their time, and walked out the door. Never raised his voice, didn't need to. When a structure is already failing, you don't have to push, just take away the last thing holding it up and step aside. Howard Otten's whole business collapsed fast once the money dried up. Harrison's withdrawal set off a domino effect. Howard's lawyers tried and failed to stop for 3 weeks. Without Hargrove, 2 of the main East Corridor projects went straight into receivership. The third sold in a fire sale, less than 40 cents on the dollar. George Hall was put on leave pending criminal charges. Harrison's firm cut ties with him quietly 2 weeks later. 4 months after the boardroom, Howard Otten filed for personal bankruptcy. Ronda moved into Howard's penthouse 3 weeks after the divorce.
She moved out 7 weeks later. No one shamed her, no one had to. She'd made a decision. Decided which man was worth more and got it wrong in every way that counted. The consequences were hers to live with. James didn't follow any of it. Papers were signed, he had finished with all of it. 6 months after the boardroom, on a Thursday morning, James Wilkins arrived at the eastern waterfront at 7:15. He wore his old utility jacket. He picked up the ceremonial shovel, looked out over the land his grandfather bought, the same land Howard tried to take with forged papers and borrowed cash, and broke ground. No speech, no announcements, no bragging about what he'd protected or what happened to the people who doubted him. Just the work, like always. Some men make a life out of telling everyone what they are. James Wilkins spent it building it. Now, at last, his name was exactly where it belonged, permanent and right there in the blueprints of a city that never really knew that name until it was impossible to erase. That's what happens when the quietest person in the room turns out to be the one that matters the most. Ronda looked at a utility jacket and thought she knew what was under it. Howard saw a stretch of waterfront and thought he knew how to take it. Neither of them learned the real rule of structural integrity. The strongest foundations are the ones you can't see from the street. James Wilkins never asked to be discovered. He was always there, on site, before sunrise, doing the work. The city finally put his name on it. If this story stuck with you, drop a comment. Tell me what hit the hardest. And if you know patience is strength, that the quiet ones are often carrying the most, subscribe. Because the next story here is going to remind you exactly why you never count someone out until you've seen what they're built on.